What happened to the American paratroopers who vanished in training missions? What really became of the men who stepped out into the empty sky and were never seen again? It begins far from the front lines. No enemy fire, no roaring battlefield, just a cold wind over an American airfield, the dull thud of boots on metal, and a row of young paratroopers checking each other's gear in silence. For every airborne division that fought overseas, thousands of jumps were made in training, and in those jumps, more men vanished in accidents, mishaps, and unexplained failures than most people will ever hear about. The records, on paper, sound simple. Lost in training, presumed drowned, did not return from exercise. Short lines typed by someone who never saw the faces behind the names. But buried in the margins of those same files is a single, disturbing note from one night exercise. A stick of paratroopers exits the aircraft as planned. Yet ground observers report fewer canopies than men who jumped. The pilots swear they saw the chutes open. The ground crews swear they did not. And in the silence between those two statements, the paratroopers are still missing. The jumps before war, there is a simplicity to the way the old training fields looked at dawn flat earth, thin mist, rows of barracks still half asleep. But beneath that quiet was a pressure every paratrooper learned to live with. Men trained as if the next jump would take them into battle. Even when the plane was only circling over empty farmland, they knew the stories. Equipment failures, sudden winds, lost parachutes. A man could vanish on a routine Tuesday morning only miles from his own bunk. In the early 1940s, new airborne battalions were forming faster than instructors could train them. Most recruits had never been inside an aircraft before. Some had never left their hometowns. Yet within weeks, they were leaping into cold air, trusting the thin canopy not to collapse, trusting that someone on the ground knew where they were supposed to land. The truth was different. They were often jumping into uncertainty with only a map, a compass, and a set of instructions shouted over engine noise. The older sergeants carried a particular silence about them. They never spoke of the early accidents, but the eyes of the newer men caught glimpses of memorial plaques, old training photos with names missing, and rumors that floated through the barracks at night. He drifted afar. The chute malfunctioned. Search party went out, but came back empty. The explanations were always clean, neat, and final. Yet the faces of the men telling these stories never matched the simplicity of their words. On one late summer evening, the Airborne School prepared for a night exercise. Floodlights cast long shadows across the tarmac as instructors checked parachutes with quick, practiced hands. The wind was steady, the weather calm. A routine jump, nothing unusual. The kind of mission that should have eased nerves, not sharpened them. Inside the aircraft, the men sat shoulder to shoulder, helmets knocking lightly with each vibration. The red interior lights made every expression look carved from stone. One of the jump masters, a veteran known for being unreadable, glanced down the line. He noticed something small, something he didn't usually see. The quiet wasn't just focused, it was uneasy. No one joked. No one swallowed loudly. A strange, anticipatory stillness seemed to travel through the plane. The order came. Stand up. Hook up. The men rose and clipped their static lines, the metal clicking in the exact rhythm instructors drilled into them. The first paratrooper moved toward the open door, and the cold night air rushed into the fuselage, carrying the scent of pine and dust and something else, an odd faint drift of smoke that no one could place. The green light ignited. They stepped into the darkness one by one, disappearing into a black sky streak with the thin moon. The jumpmaster counted each silhouette as it fell away, feeling the usual satisfaction of a clean exit. 12 men out. 12 canopies should open. 12 figures drifting to the earth below. But on the ground, the observer saw something different. Only 9 chutes bloomed against the night. 3 were missing. At first the ground crew assumed they had miscounted. The moon was weak. The sky was uneven. Shadows played tricks. Yet when the men reached the landing zone, the numbers still didn't match. 9 paratroopers gathered at the assembly point, shaken but alive. 3 were unaccounted for. The jumpmaster insisted he saw every chute deploy. He was certain of it. He repeated the claim twice, then 3 times, his voice tightening each time. One of the pilots supported him, saying he glimpsed multiple white canopies before the plane banked away. But the ground crew stood firm. They saw only 9. They were sure of that. Search teams moved quickly. Trucks rolled into the tree line. Lanterns cut through the branches. Dogs traced the wooded gullies east of the landing site. Radios buzzed with clipped reports. But no one found torn silk, no harness, No broken branches, no bodies, no footprints, nothing. It was as if the missing men had fallen through the night and simply never reached the ground. By sunrise, the official report was already being drafted. The language was careful. Phrases like likely drifted off course and presumed landed beyond designated zones softened the reality. A brief notation at the bottom recorded the conflicting canopy counts, but it was thin, vague, placed where no one was expected to look closely. The families would receive the same simplicity, missing during training. Yet everyone at the airfield that morning felt the same quiet question, pressing at the edges of their thoughts. How could 3 men disappear in clear weather, in controlled conditions, with no trace left behind? In the mess hall that afternoon, soldiers spoke in low voices. Some refused to believe the chutes open. Others swore the jumpmaster was to experience 2 miscount. A few wondered whether the men drifted into the river miles away. But even that theory frayed quickly. The currents were mild that night, and the banks were thoroughly searched. Late in the evening, an officer reviewed the flight logs again. One line caught his attention, something he had missed earlier. The aircraft had reported a brief flicker in its instrument panel during the minutes after the drop. A small electrical disturbance that stabilized almost immediately. Nothing dramatic, nothing dangerous, but strange enough to be noted. Strange enough to raise a question he did not write into the report. The next day, the training resumed. New men stood in line, adjusting their straps, tightening their helmets. They knew about the disappearances, everyone did, but airborne training did not pause for fear. The instructors were stern, the orders precise, and the sky above them looked exactly the same as it always had. Still, even from a distance, it was clear the field had changed. The air felt heavier, conversations shorter. Every man checking his gear felt a quiet urge to triple check. Every glance at the horizon carried the same unspoken thought. If 3 men could vanish on a clear night over friendly ground, how many others had disappeared in ways no report had ever captured? Days later, a rumor spread about an object seen near the drop zone, a strange silhouette drifting behind the failing moon. It was dismissed almost immediately as a misinterpreted shadow. But once the idea took root that something else might have been in the sky, that night it didn't leave. And then, nearly a week after the incident, a hiker miles outside the training perimeter reported something unsettling. The sound of fabric flapping high in the trees, like a torn canopy hanging where no trail existed. Searchers followed the lead, pushing deeper and deeper into the woods until the light thinned and the forest swallowed their voices. The search ended at dusk. They returned empty-handed, yet the sound the hiker described lingered in their minds, because one of the searchers later swore he heard it too. The flapping of silk, faint, irregular, coming from somewhere deeper than they traveled. But he didn't tell the others until months later, and by then, 3 names had already been carved onto the memorial stone outside the barracks, marked with the same phrase no one could bring themselves to say aloud: missing in training. The question remained suspended in every breath on that airfield. If the men had truly fallen into the darkness, why did the darkness give nothing back? The next chapter begins where the sky becomes far less forgiving. The night over water, long before the pilots saw the coastline, they felt the change in the air. A colder sweep across the wings, a faint tremor climbing the fuselage. It wasn't enough to raise alarms, but enough to make the navigator glance twice at his instruments. The orders were clear: a night training jump over open water, designed to push new paratroopers into conditions they would likely face in wartime. Darkness, cold, disorientation, the kind of environment that punished hesitation inside the aircraft. The men sat wrapped in their gear, their breath barely visible in the red glow. They could smell the engine oil, the canvas straps, the metallic tang of nerves. None of them mentioned the 3 missing soldiers from the land exercise a week earlier, yet the memory hung between them, unspoken but alive. Every one of them knew their names. Men who had slept in these same bunks, men who had eaten at the same tables, men who had joked about this exact training mission only days before. The sea below was black and windless, a perfect surface that reflected no light. The pilots had flown this route many times. They called it predictable, safe, a controlled environment that left little room for surprises. But even they felt something different tonight, though none wanted to be the first to say it. When the aircraft banked toward the drop zone, a thin hiss cracked through the radio. The crew chief frowned and tapped the headset. Static, sharp, irregular, scraping like something brushing against the antenna. He adjusted the dial. The noise faded, then returned, louder. The pilots exchanged a wary glance, but protocol forced them to continue. No weather warnings, no emergencies, no excuse to abort died down the line. The jumpmaster braced himself near the open door as the wind exploded into the cabin. His boots dug into the metal floor. His grip tightened. Normally he shouted small reassurances, subtle nods the men relied on. Tonight, he said nothing. He watched the horizon, jaw locked, as if waiting for something he had hoped never to see again. The green light flickered once, steadied, then turned bright. The men rose in absolute silence. They moved with practiced precision, hooking lines, adjusting straps, leaning forward with the slow sway of the aircraft. The jumpmaster gave the signal, and the first paratrooper stepped into nothingness. The second followed, then the third. 11 men gone, swallowed by the night. On the 12th, something shifted. A gust hit the plane harder than expected, shoving the jumper off balance. He steadied himself, took a breath, and leapt. The jumpmaster counted each departure automatically, but a strange detail caught his eye. No canopy glints appeared in the moonlight. Usually he could see at least one flicker of white. Tonight, the sky remained an unbroken sheet of black. He blinked, looked again, nothing. The pilot called back over the intercom, voice strained and static. Confirmed visual on chutes. The jumpmaster leaned outward, gripping the edge of the doorway. Darkness met him. Not even the faint outlines of drifting bodies. No descending silhouettes. No shadows shifting against the sea. He stepped back, heart pounding. The pilot's voice cracked again. "Do you see them?" The jumpmaster hesitated, then finally replied, "No." The aircraft made its return pass over the planned landing zone. Searchlights sweeping the water. The beam slid across the waves, empty and untouchable. The pilot reported the anomaly up the chain, noting the unexpected wind shear. He ended the message with a sentence that would be repeated for years afterward. Chute deployment unconfirmed by the time the plane reached the airfield. Emergency crews were already scrambling. Boats launched from the harbor. Spotters lined the coastline with binoculars. Radios hissed with clipped, urgent words. They expected debris, broken harnesses, something. What they found instead was a sea as smooth as glass. The official search expanded through the night, then into the next morning. Helicopters traced paths over the waves. Divers scanned the depths. A naval vessel joined the grid. Every sweep returned nothing. The men had jumped. That part was certain. But every sign that should have followed a floating pack, a torn chute, a boot, anything was absent. Around noon, a pilot from one of the search planes reported something unusual. A small, circular ripple far from the primary zone. Too small to be a person. Too perfect to be natural. He marked the coordinates. A team investigated. Nothing waited there but empty water and unbroken sky. Onshore, tension rose inside the command post. Charts covered the tables. Wind patterns, drift probabilities, tide behavior all studied and restudied. The officers grew sharper in tone, snapping at details that made no difference. A sense of mounting unease threaded through every conversation. Late in the afternoon, someone replayed the pilot's radio transmission from the flight. A sound surfaced beneath his words. Something faint, almost mechanical, almost rhythmic. It lasted to seconds, maybe less. Not long enough to identify, but long enough to unsettle every man in the room. The recording was replayed 5 times. Then it was ordered sealed. The families were notified the next morning. We regret to inform you. Training exercise. Missing over water. Search ongoing. Standard language. No specifics. No mention of the radio interference or the missing silhouettes, or the fact that the ocean had revealed nothing, not even a scrap of gear. 2 days later, a fisherman reported seeing what he described as a flaring of light under the surface, miles from the drop zone. He claimed it looked like a parachute sinking, glowing faintly white as it slipped into the dark. Investigators made a note, then quietly dismissed it, but one officer did follow up. He visited the fisherman's dock at night, asking him to demonstrate what he saw. The fisherman pointed to a patch of sea and said only this: it wasn't drifting like cloth. It was moving, like it chose to go down. The officer didn't include that part in his report. Back at the airfield, the surviving paratroopers viewed the empty bunks of the missing men with a heaviness that reached beyond fear. They packed their gear in silence. They folded uniforms that would never be worn again. One soldier stood staring at a pair of boots left neatly by a bed, laces tucked inside exactly the way the missing man always prepared them before a jump. He whispered something under his breath, a question he didn't intend anyone to hear. "Where did you go?" The weeks rolled forward. Training resumed. The incident was referenced less and less, replaced by new schedules, new exercises, new faces arriving to replace the ones lost. But late one night, when most of the barracks slept, a mechanic walked alone across the empty runway and paused. The wind carried a sound from high above, faint, distant, moving, a pattern he didn't recognize, a rustle that reminded him of parachute silk catching the air. He looked up, nothing, just the sky, the same sky that never returned the missing. He stood there for a long moment, palms cold against his tools, listening as the sound faded into the darkness. Then he turned back toward the hangars, unable to shake the feeling that the sky had not been empty at all, and that whatever was up there wasn't finished. Files, families, and missing men. The letters arrived in ordinary envelopes, the kind anyone might mistake for a bill or a neighbor's note. Inside were the official words carefully arranged, quietly devastating. Missing in training. Search procedures ongoing. No further information available at this time. The sentences were short, almost expressionless, written by someone who had never seen the faces reading them. For the families, the world shifted instantly. Kitchens went silent. Radios were turned off mid-song. A chair was left pulled back from a table where someone had been sitting seconds before. Mothers pressed trembling fingers against the paper. Wives read the lines twice, then a third time, hoping something new would appear. Fathers stared out windows as if expecting their sons to walk up the dirt road, and opened the door anyway. In one small house in Tennessee, a young woman kept her porch light burning for 3 nights straight. Her brother had been on the water jump. She sat outside until the insects thickened around the bulb, waiting for a truck she knew would never arrive. On the 4th night, she folded the letter and placed it in a drawer beside his childhood photograph. The military sent officers to explain the situation, but their answers were soft, rehearsed, and painfully limited. Conditions were challenging, recovery efforts exhaustive, final outcome uncertain. They spoke as if trying to make absence sound organized. But the families heard something else in their pauses, fear of questions they could not answer. Weeks after the disappearances, one of the officers assigned to casualty notifications visited the headquarters records room. He was a man who believed in order, accuracy, proper procedure. But the reports from the land incident and the water jump unsettled him. The canopy miscount, the missing silhouettes, the silence over the ocean. He could not dismiss the feeling that something had been reduced to neatly. The records room was windowless, cool, and lined with tall gray cabinets. He opened the drawer marked Airborne, Training Incidents, expecting to find thick bundles of supplementary notes, as was common in complex cases. Instead, he found thin folders far thinner than the circumstances deserved. He opened the first one. Inside were the basic forms, name, rank, next of kin, the summary paragraph. He read the summary twice. It made no mention of the wind shear anomaly. No mention of the jumpmaster's statement. No mention of the missing canopies or the conflicting observations. It simply said the men were presumed lost due to equipment malfunction or drift error. He closed the folder slowly. His jaw clenched. Behind him, another officer entered the room, searching for a different file. They exchanged a brief glance. Something unspoken passed between them, two men aware that the truth of the disappearances had already been trimmed down before ever reaching this drawer. Later that afternoon, the first officer requested access to the sealed radio logs. He framed it as a routine cross-check. Permission was granted. He listened to the recording alone in a quiet office. The pilot's strained voice came through clearly, describing the drop and the conditions. Then the faint sound surfaced again, the same mechanical, pulsing distortion heard beneath the wind. He leaned closer, replaying it, adjusting the volume. It wasn't static. It wasn't interference he recognized. It almost resembled breathing, but to rhythmic, to controlled. He listened once more. The sound cut off abruptly, replaced by a sharp burst of static, then silence. He removed the headphones and sat motionless for several seconds. That part, he knew, would never be shared with the families. Across the country, those families were living through their own private storms. Some clung to the idea that their sons had drifted into remote terrain and were surviving on skill and stubbornness. Others believed the sea might yet return something, gear, a body, a clue. Days passed, then weeks. Hope shifted into a quieter shape, like an ember kept alive more out of duty than logic. One mother wrote 3 letters to the command requesting details. Each reply was shorter than the last. She asked whether her son might have been injured and rescued by fishermen. She asked if perhaps he had been carried far by wind. She even asked if there were places the search hadn't reached. The only answer she received was a phrase repeated 3 times. No definitive information is available, but something was available. It simply wasn't being shared. Inside the Airborne base, a chaplain visited the barracks where the missing men had lived. He stood alone in the room, the bunk stripped bare, the personal items stored away. A heavy stillness lingered. He found himself staring at the empty spaces where duffel bags had once rested, where boots had dried after long marches, where laughter had filled the narrow aisles before lights out. He whispered a prayer not because anyone asked him to, but because the silence felt too sharp without it. Shortly after his visit, maintenance crews were instructed to clear out the last of the abandoned gear. One crewman, moving a footlocker, paused when he noticed a sheet of paper taped inside the lid. It was a handwritten note from one of the missing paratroopers, dated the days before the jump. He read only one line before a cold tightness gripped his chest. Night jumps don't scare me. It's the feeling right before the door opens, like the air is waiting for us. The crewman folded the note and handed it to a supervisor, who delivered it to an officer. Within hours, the note disappeared into a sealed envelope and was stored in a cabinet the enlisted men could not access. Meanwhile, the jumpmaster from the water mission had begun waking in the middle of the night, gasping for air. He avoided mirrors in the early hours because he didn't want to see what exhaustion had carved into his face. He replayed the jump again and again in his mind, searching for something he might have missed. A flash, a shadow, a figure, anything. The part that tore at him was the same detail he would never say aloud. When he looked into that black sky when no silhouettes appeared, he didn't feel confusion. He felt watched. He carried that feeling into every briefing, every training day, every quiet walk across the tarmac. He hid it well. Until the evening, he broke protocol and visited the officer who had examined the radio logs. The 2 men met in an empty hallway. Their voices were low, controlled, but strained at the edges. The jumpmaster asked a single question. "Did you hear anything on that recording? Anything that shouldn't have been there?" The officer hesitated, eyes narrowing. "What makes you ask that?" The jumpmaster's answer came softly. "Because something was wrong before they jumped, and whatever it was, didn't stay behind." They stood in silence, listening to the distant hum of generators outside. Neither man spoke further. Neither needed to. Soon after, a memo circulated quietly through the command staff. It instructed personnel not to discuss unverified anomalies related to training losses. It emphasized morale, clarity, discipline. It discouraged speculation. It did not mention the missing men by name, and as the memo moved through the ranks, another development arrived, something that pulled the entire base back into the mystery. They were trying to bury. A coastal patrol unit reported debris washed up on a remote stretch of shoreline nearly 50 miles from the designated jump area. Not equipment, not bodies, just a sliver of fabric tangled around driftwood, pale and weathered. The officer in charge expected a scrap of parachute silk, but when he examined it, a chill passed through him. It wasn't parachute material. It wasn't military-grade fabric at all, and it was torn in a way no one could explain. He sent it to the lab for analysis. The lab never returned a report, and late that night, the officer who submitted the sample received a simple instruction: item reassigned. No further inquiry. He stared at the message, heart thumping, aware of what it meant. Something had surfaced, something they weren't allowed to name, and somewhere in the dark water beyond the shoreline, the waves were moving again. Survivors and things not talked about. It began with a man who refused to speak at all. He had been part of a training jump months before the disappearances one that officially ended without incident, one the records listed as routine. His name never appeared in any accident report. He wasn't injured. He returned to base like everyone else. But as the stories of the missing spread quietly through the barracks, someone remembered him. The soldier who stepped away from the formation after landing and sat alone on the ground, helmet still on, staring at the sky. His squad leader had tried to ask what happened, but the man only shook his head. Not no, not yes, something closer to fear. And that fear followed him into the weeks ahead, settling into his eyes, making him flinch in the presence of open doors, sudden gusts, even radio static. He completed his duties with perfect precision, but he never jumped again. Medical discharge, psychological reasons. That's all anyone was told. But one night, shortly after the water disappearances, a former squad mate visited him off base. They sat in silence until the discharged paratrooper finally spoke. I saw something below the clouds, he whispered, and it saw me. He didn't describe it. He couldn't. His hands trembled violently when he tried. The squad mate would later insist he imagined it, but the fear in the man's voice was something he never forgot. There were other stories fragments. Quiet admissions shared only when the lights were low and the air felt safe. A pilot recalled flying through a layer of haze that wasn't supposed to be there. His instruments blinked once, then steadied. He thought nothing of it, until he heard about the men lost over water and realized the haze had appeared exactly over the same coordinates. Another memory surfaced from a senior instructor, a man with decades of jump experience. He remembered a cloudy morning years earlier, a simple exercise. 3 men jumped from his plane, only to land where they were meant to. The third drifted into a ravine. They found him an hour later, shaken, pale, unable to explain why he had cut away his parachute mid-descent. He told the medics he saw movement in the air beside him, something sliding past more silently than the wind, something he could not name. But his report was filed under panic-induced malfunction, and the incident faded from official memory. The disappearances, however, made these old stories echo differently. Men gathered in corners of the mess hall, speaking in low tones. Someone always checked the door before saying anything real. They weren't afraid of officers, they were afraid of sounding like the ones who snapped under pressure, afraid their experiences would be dismissed, recorded as weakness, polished away like every uncomfortable detail in the reports. One evening, a group of pilots met in a maintenance shed after hours. A single lantern lit the space, casting long shadows over the walls. They discussed recent training missions, things they had noticed but never written down. A moment of sudden radio silence, a drift of fog appearing from clear skies, a strange echo in the headphones that always vanished the moment someone else walked into the cockpit. The oldest pilot leaned forward, voice barely above a breath. "It isn't the equipment," he said, "and it isn't the weather." He let the lantern flicker across his face before finishing. "It's the feeling, right before the jump light turns green, like something is close, too close." No one challenged him, not because they agreed, but because everyone had felt something they couldn't explain. And then there were the jump masters, the men who carried the weight of every exit. They were trained to be steady, unshakable, immune to fear, yet even they were not untouched. In private, one admitted hearing footsteps behind him in the aircraft during the jump extra steps, out of sync with the men. He turned quickly, expecting to see someone standing there. No one was there. The engines roared. The lights pulsed. The men lined up motionless. But the sound of those steps stuck with him, fading only when he convinced himself it was vibration from the fuselage. Another jump master recalled something darker. After one night exercise, he counted his men on the ground, all accounted for. But as he turned away, he saw a silhouette deeper in the tree line. A man still wearing a chute, helmet low, unmoving. The jump master called out. The figure didn't respond. When he took a step toward him, blinking through the dark, the silhouette vanished. Not into shadow, not behind a tree. It simply wasn't there anymore. He told no one. He knew how it would sound. But the image stayed with him, carved into memory like a wound that never quite healed. As the weeks passed, the pressure on the base thickened. Training intensified, but conversations thinned. Men avoided the night sky, glancing upward only long enough to confirm nothing hung over them. Some swore the airfield felt different, quieter, heavier, like something unseen was watching the routine of daily life with a patience that didn't belong to wind or weather. And then, at the height of this collective unease, a story surfaced from a pilot who had flown the same aircraft model involved in the water mission. During a late-night check, he entered the cockpit alone, preparing for a routine inspection. The interior was dark and still. As he leaned over the instrument panel, he heard a faint clicking behind him, static, irregular, almost like tapping. He froze, listening. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. He turned slowly. The cabin was empty. He took one step forward, and the clicking stopped instantly. He backed away. It resumed. He reached for the radio switch, but before he touched it, a thin, breath-like sound floated through the headset hanging above the seat, soft, steady, to deliberate to be random interference. The pilot left the plane without finishing the inspection. He didn't tell anyone until months later. The sense of something hovering at the edges of these incidents, something always just out of sight, began to feel like a presence threaded through every story. Not a creature, not an object, something less defined, but no less real. And then came the account that tightened every rumor into a sharper, colder shape. A paratrooper who survived a near-fatal malfunction requested a private meeting with a chaplain. His chute had deployed late almost delayed and he landed hard, fracturing his shoulder. Most assumed the wind had thrown him off, but alone with the chaplain, he gave a different explanation. He said that as he fell through the night, the air around him bent strangely, as if something passed him at impossible speed. He felt a pull not upward, not downward, but sideways, tugging at him until he screamed from the pressure. Then it was gone. The chaplain never wrote this in any log. He simply sat there afterward, shaken, unsure whether the man had hallucinated in panic or glimpsed something no one was meant to see. But the most unsettling detail emerged days later, when a medic reviewing the injured paratrooper's gear noticed a deep, smooth cut along one of the straps. Not torn, not frayed, a clean slice, almost surgical. The medic reported it, but the note was removed from the file within 24 hours. By now, the disappearances were no longer isolated stories or accidents buried in paperwork. They felt interconnected, as if each event pointed toward a truth the base wasn't ready to accept. And just when it seemed the past might finally settle, another message crackled over the radio during a routine flight. Unintelligible, barely audible, but one phrase repeated twice: falling, not alone. The transmission wasn't traced to any aircraft, and the signal source was lost almost immediately. That night, a storm rolled in unexpectedly, pounding the airfield with winds strong enough to shake the hangars. Lightning carved the sky. Rain hammered the windows. The men watched from inside, listening to thunder roll over the place where so many had vanished. And then the power flickered. For a moment, in the brief darkness, someone swore they saw a figure outside standing on the runway, facing the storm, unmoving. When the lights returned, the runway was empty. No one stepped outside to check, and no one slept easily, because deep down, each man felt the same unspoken fear. Whatever was happening wasn't over, and the next disappearance might happen on land, or in daylight, or with witnesses watching. Theories. In an empty sky the morning after the storm, the airfield looked washed clean, but no one believed the sky had reset itself. The rain had soaked into the soil, pulling in the ruts left by trucks, darkening the hangar roofs, and leaving a damp chill in the barracks. It should have felt like a fresh start. Instead, the place carried the aftertaste of something unfinished. Like the storm had revealed cracks rather than erased them, the officers gathered early, coffee steaming in metal mugs as they reviewed training schedules. Their voices were steady, clipped, businesslike, but beneath the surface, tension threaded every word. Too many things no longer fit the neat explanations. Too many old reports now sounded like warnings no one took seriously. They tried to treat the recent radio message as interference, as if saying it aloud would make it smaller. Yet every man in that room had heard the phrase, falling, not alone, out on the airstrip. Mechanics worked in silence. Tools clicked. Engines hummed. No jokes passed between them. Their eyes flicked to the sky more often than to the aircraft they repaired. One mechanic paused mid-check, tightening a bolt with slow, cautious movements. He had been the one who thought he saw a figure on the runway during the blackout. He hadn't slept since. Every time he closed his eyes, he replayed the shape standing in the rain, unmoving, facing the storm. He couldn't shake the thought that it hadn't been a person at all. By midday, rumors were moving across the base like wind through tall grass. Some blamed equipment failures. Others blamed flawed training procedures or harsh weather patterns that didn't show up on radar. But deeper conversations were happening in quiet corners. Hypotheses spoken only when no officers were near. A few soldiers believed the disappearances were connected to a navigational error so severe it shifted entire groups off the map. Others whispered about unexpected downdrafts creating lethal pockets of air. A handful wondered if classified experiments were being tested near training routes, the kind never written into flight logs. And then there were the ones who said nothing at all. They didn't believe in theories. They believed in what they felt. Watchfulness, presence, the sense of being observed. The jumpmaster from the water mission spent the afternoon in the equipment room, tightening straps on newly issued parachutes. He moved with practiced precision, but his face remained drawn, as if sleep had been replaced by memory. As he leaned over a pack, he heard someone step into the room behind him. He turned. An officer stood in the doorway, one he had spoken to only once before. The man's tone was measured, but his eyes gave away the truth he wanted answers just as badly. Did you lose visual before or after the turbulence hit? The officer asked. Before, the jumpmaster said. Long before, the officer nodded. And the men looked. Normal, calm, calm, the jumpmaster said quietly, but alert. More than usual, the officer hesitated. What do you think happened up there? The jumpmaster stared at the floor for several seconds before speaking. I don't know what happened, he said, but I know what didn't. It wasn't drift. It wasn't wind. And it wasn't human error. The officer didn't react outwardly. He simply placed a folded piece of paper on the table and walked out. The jumpmaster unfolded it, expecting another memo about silence or procedure. Instead, it was a copy of a handwritten transcription from the sealed radio logs, a section no one had been told existed. The message was faint, almost erased by static, but a few words remained decipherable. Pulling, not wind. Something. The sentence cut off abruptly. The jumpmaster sank onto the bench, paper trembling in his hands. For the first time, he felt less alone in his disbelief. Someone else knew the reports didn't match reality. Someone had gone looking for truth buried in static. Later that evening, a meeting was held in a dim conference room. Only a handful of officers attended, men chosen carefully, men trusted to keep silent. The door was closed and locked. The lights were turned low. The discussion was supposed to be procedural, but it unraveled immediately into something else. They reviewed every chart they had, every wind model, every drift pattern, every survival probability calculation. Nothing explained the clean vanishings. Nothing explained the missing canopies. Nothing explained the cut strap or the flaring under the water or the breath-like sound of the recordings. One officer slammed his pencil onto the table. We are missing the part of the story that matters, he said. Something happened that none of our maps account for. The room fell silent. Another officer, older and slower to speak, exhaled heavily. We could be looking in the wrong direction, he said. We're assuming the men fell as they should have fallen. But what if something altered the descent? Not a malfunction, not panic, something external. The air in the room tightened. Nobody writes that into a report, someone muttered. Nobody needs to, the older officer replied. But we all know the difference between improbable and impossible. And what we're seeing isn't impossible. It's unexplained. They spent hours circling possibilities, none of which brought them closer to answers. By the end, the only consensus was that they were missing a crucial piece, something hidden outside the boundaries of what training manuals dared to imagine. When the meeting finally broke, the officers stepped outside into the cool night. The sky was clear, stars sharp and bright, the kind of night paratroopers would call perfect for a jump, but no one lingered to admire it. Back in the barracks, the younger recruits were preparing for another day of training. One soldier lay awake, staring at the bunk above him, listening to the soft breathing of the others. He didn't know the details of the disappearances, not like the senior men did, but he felt the change in the air. He felt the heaviness of silence when instructors passed by. He felt the shift in the way pilots checked their instruments. Lingering just a second along on each gauge dot at the far end of the room, another soldier murmured in his sleep, a soft, broken whisper, "Don't jump, don't jump." The room fell still. No one got up to wake him. Near midnight, when the base was quiet, a guard patrolling the perimeter paused near the tree line. His flashlight beam cut through the mist rising from the ground. He heard something soft, distant, drifting above him rather than around him. Fabric flapping, slow and rhythmic, like a parachute caught on a high branch. His heart hammered in his ribs. He aimed the flashlight upward. Leaves, branches, mist. Nothing else, but the sound continued, faint and wrong, as if hovering just beyond the reach of the light. He stepped back, breath quick, unsure whether to call it in. Reporting strange sounds had become a quiet joke among the men, the kind of thing that invited lectures about stress or nerves. He turned to head back toward the main road. Then froze. The sound stopped completely, and in the silence that followed, he sensed something above him, something he couldn't see, but could feel, like a pressure in the air, heavy and cold. He didn't look up again. He walked fast, almost running. By the time he reached the floodlit edge of the airstrip, his hands shook violently, but he forced himself to keep moving, keep breathing, keep pretending nothing had followed him out of the trees, across the base. The same thought rested in the minds of men who had never spoken to each other. The disappearances weren't finished, and whatever was happening wasn't limited to the sky anymore. The night seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next jump.